Welcome to the Mystery College podcast. Today we have a special guest, Daniel Ingram. He's the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. Really fantastic book that's unusually hardcore, as it suggests in the title. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the book, but also we're going to go into some more Western esoteric occult practices, since Daniel also is a practice in magic as well. Welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you so much for podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start off with what brought you into your Dharma journey, and then also what brought you into doing Western occultism practices.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I started having blissful and peaceful experiences when I was a really young kid. I was like 3 or 4, and then I had my first lucid flying dream at age 5. And then I took a weird meditation course in a hippie Quaker school called Carolina Friend School in Durham, North Carolina, in 4th grade, called Close Encounters, which was mostly about analog synthesizers and basic visualization and progressive relaxation meditations. And then around 14 or 15, I had my first massive explosion of consciousness, my first out-of-body experience, the classic lift out, see yourself there on the bed, float through the wall, freak out, snap back, buzz and paralysis, and what the hell was that? And then I was kind of off and running and started having odd experiences, and I had no idea what they were. And I was very much a scientific materialist at that point. So I kind of kept all this stuff sort of hyper compartmentalized. But then what really sort of got me into magic, in addition to a bunch of strange experiences I had had on retreats, was my sister's husband's sister's now ex-husband, but then husband. So my brother-in-law was a guy named Honey Bunny, and Honey Bunny was into Thelema and chaos magic and other interesting stuff like that. And so, but also a real meditator. And so we had a lot of very interesting conversations and traded a lot of books and texts and started trading techniques and trying to understand each other's vocabulary, which led to, a few-year process of really thinking hard about what each of these things meant and what you could do with them and how to translate across between various Western systems and Eastern systems. And that opened up a whole range of explorations into all kinds of things. So that's how it all began in summary. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That was in the 90s. So it's been a while now. So I've been playing around with this stuff for 30 years since then almost.
Wow. Yeah, and it's pretty fascinating because back then, like, there wasn't nearly as much stuff out there or people practicing openly, and here in 2025, it's the cat's out of the bag.
That's true. Yeah, the internet changed the world. But back then you had to, order books online. It was hard to find some of this stuff. Sorry, not even order books online. You would sometimes just like go to the local bookstore and order them and things like that.
Yeah, and that kind of one thing I'm curious about too is as a arhat, as someone who's had attainments through practicing Dharma practices. I'm curious if you find any overlap with Western esotericism, with certain states of gnosis or meditative trance that feel equivocal to any Dharmic states.
That is actually a huge and long, complicated question, which we could go on and on and on about. Where does one even begin? Obviously, if you're coming from sort of a Western esoteric system, one of the classic debates then is what do the 10 ranks of the Golden Dawn, how do those relate to stages of awakening? Is Adeptus Minor this, is Tiferet that, is Crossing the Abyss and Doth the Dark Night, is Kether, or however you pronounce it, stream entry, are there 4 trees of life, and do those, that stack on top of each other, do those correlate with the paths? And these obvious sorts of questions, Ayan Sof are, whatever, these kinds of debates into those, which of those, how do they represent things? And then how does that tie in with things like Catholic mysticism and the sort of nothingness states that St. John of the Cross talks about? And obviously these are fun discussions. They don't often have great resolutions. One can see some what I think are interesting correspondences. So I'm relatively comfortable calling Tiferet, or however you pronounce it. What's your favorite way to pronounce this? The middle one on the tree of life.
Pronounce it the same way, Tiferet.
Yeah. And so is that the rising and passing away? It kind of seems like it could be, right? So your first taste, your first opening. And then one of the really fun ones is knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. Is that a very particular mystical experience? Is that a standard stage of development? Is that the A&P? Is that stream entry? Sort of trying to line up Buddhist models. It's not like I ever came to perfectly firm opinions about these things, because often the framework and what's important and the criteria are just different enough that you're like, yeah, well, kind of, maybe, sort of. It's hard to tell exactly what they were talking about because usually the technical old pragmatic Theravada Buddhists and the Western esotericists had pretty different agendas and conceptual frameworks they were working through, but certainly fun conversations to have. I don't know if you want to play with any of that, just as the initial things I'm throwing out. And then obviously realms are realms. That's pretty straightforward. You find realms in all the traditions because realms are a thing.
Right.
Entities are entities. You find entities in all the traditions because entities are something you can experience regardless of their ontological status. And and then the basics of magic are things that you find pretty much everywhere. So even in old school Buddhism, there was plenty of magic. In fact, there's way more about magic in the text than there is about insight, oddly enough, and encounters with entities and beings and going to other realms and powers and stuff. Plenty of very, what we might Western retrofitted call animism in Buddhism, which obviously looks like a lot of the stuff you see in magic and interactions with demons and the whole concept of lots of different orders of beings. That all pretty much lines up. It's just a question of which ones are exactly which, but you could see some similar parallels, obviously, because this is human experience, right? You find these things in pretty much all cultures because humans experience these things. So that's just like some fun places to begin. I don't know what you want to deal with that. Or
Yeah,
what
like
would be fun?
it's a can of worms we just opened here for sure.
Mhm.
One thing I wanted to follow up on what you just said was that like a good portion of the Buddhist texts and books are dedicated towards speaking of more mystical, magical experiences, if you will. I'm familiar with that in Vajrayana schools or Mahayana schools, but for whatever reason, I was wondering if that seemed to be the case too in Theravada schools.
Oh yeah, the Theravada, definitely. So there's a great book I recommend called Esoteric Theravada by Kate Crosby, which is sort of an introduction to not only what it sort of used to look like, but also kind of what happened. So what happened is colonialism, and colonialism did the same thing to, it was sort of Western, quote unquote, Enlightenment, rationalist, semi-materialist Protestant Christianity, which is obviously a set of paradoxes right there. But what that did to the Theravada in its host countries is when the colonialists came in, the Theravadans, particularly in places like Thailand, Sri Lanka, but also Burma, etc., very much felt like in order to stay relevant or to stay acceptable or to defend themselves, they had to appear more rational, more scientific, less weird, less threatening to the Christian powers or the sort of rationalist powers that had taken them over. And so a lot of the practices about blessing things or amulets or banishing whatever creatures, or all of the very elaborate visualizations and symbols and this, the stuff you find in esoteric traditions either just disappeared entirely or was hidden. And then by going into hiding, really diminished. And now you find very, very few, certainly practitioners that are willing to talk about these things. Although if you go back to places like Thailand and Cambodia and stuff, you find plenty of monks that will talk about the future, or do past life readings, or bless amulets, or bless crops or babies or whatever, and do healings and talk about all kinds of esoteric stuff. So it's still there. It's just not very prominent. And then what came to the West was even like, so if the first huge hit to the weird end of the Theravada was colonialism, the second huge hit to the weird end of the Theravada was the hippies, right? And so the hippies, weirdly enough, these people are like into psychedelics and tripping and everything's groovy and divine consciousness or whatever, but they actually seem to like their Buddhism pretty dry, to put it gently. In fact, weirdly dry, like vastly drier than you even found them in these colonialized or colonized traditions. And so what they brought back, the sort of mix of Zen getting to the West sort of first is not quite entirely true, but kind of true. So got there maybe 10 years earlier in the 50s and early 60s. And then the Theravada kind of followed with the Insight Meditation Society people and people who studied with Ajahn Chah and those sorts of people. And they brought back a very incredibly stripped down, incredibly non-esoteric Buddhism that really, in some ways, looks almost nothing like what you find in the original traditional cultures, except in a few core elements. And so that's kind of how we got this weird perception that the Theravada is this dry thing, and this very, very normie thing. And it's just mindfulness. And you're sitting down, you're sitting and walking and noting or paying attention to your body scan or whatever. But that's like this teeny little bit of what this vast kaleidoscopic thing not only is, but excruciatingly teeny in comparison to what it has been.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. So the piece about colonization, and then also as a cultural export to more Western audiences in the 60s. And then I suppose more recently with like the integration of many Buddhistic practices and principles into a secularized scientific sense as well.
Yeah, that's the next thing that happened was mindfulness, right? Mindfulness made a lot of grand compromises. And these grand compromises is nothing weird to see here. This is just paying attention and calming down. Your thoughts come and go. Your feelings come and go. Notice with equanimity, nothing else. Doesn't do anything weird ever. Nobody's going to have strange experiences. If they do, it's because they're crazy, they're doing it wrong, or not it. Not us. No way. All the stuff they say in these old books, like, that about what all this stuff can do. I mean, they know about it, but they don't want to talk about it. So yeah, so that was how they snuck this incredibly powerful technology that can do some very weird things into a clinical mainstream that really was not looking for weird things.
I see. I see. Yeah. Yeah. So, pros and cons to that clearly, like where
Oh yeah.
teachings get to is expedient means that are like it helps people bottom line. But then it's like, and then the deeper stuff's there for those who seek it or resonate with it, I suppose.
Yeah, although when you're told it's not there, it would be as if you spent your entire life in kindergarten, were told first grade didn't exist, much less junior high school, which can get much weirder, and high school don't exist, much less college and grad school don't exist, right? So the big thing was like, it's only kindergarten. It never goes past that. Okay. And then there are a lot of adults that grow up believing that, like meditation does nothing weird. It has no side effects. Really? You sure about that? Huh. Okay. But, they end up essentially, it's like believing in Santa Claus or something. So they get these very sort of primitive, childlike beliefs, these fantastic beliefs, which oddly enough are anti-fantastic.
Yeah, that's a better anti-fantastic. Yeah, a kind of one thing I want to parallel with too is, and as someone who's trained in medicine and where the scientific consensus of reality is expediently important for care. Like another parallel experientially, like anecdotally, as meditators, we have quite phenomenal experiences, sometimes individual, sometimes shared within a group or cross-culturally, and under many guises. So I'm curious about the, like, what's it like to have like very methodical, precise training in Western medicine, allopathic medicine, and then also have, extreme level of competency with meditative practices, introspection, and to not allow the consensus of today's reality, today's milieu and zeitgeist to influence your own internal practice, because it's very brave. It's very brave.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I kept these things hyper compartmentalized for a long time. So people who've seen some of my other podcasts, I'll talk about like Daniel one that had these weird experiences I was talking about, and went on intensive retreats and learned to meditate and do all this stuff and became obsessed with these old practice manuals and trying to figure out how to do something with them and how to master the states and stages of them. And then Daniel 2 was trained in medicine, where we were told all this stuff didn't exist and or was crazy and needed meds, which was uncomfortable. And there was at least about 10 of us in medical school who kind of found each other and had some of these adventures in consciousness. Some of us were a little bit older. We had some adventures in our mid-20s outside of, we weren't just like biology majors straight into medical school with, down the line, we had some wandering in the middle. And those of us who had wandered a bit kind of found each other and supported each other, but we didn't talk about this stuff at all. Like it would, could be career suicide, certainly at that time, and maybe in some places still, to talk about the sort of experiences and things we had done, seen, etc. And then it wasn't really until my friend Judd Brewer and Willoughby Britton put me in a scanner at Yale, and I started to notice that, wow, you can see on an fMRI meditative states and stages. And that's where the epistemics, through neuroscience, at least for me, really began to come together, where it's like, I can do this thing with my mind and they can notice this thing that's happening on the scanner that correlates with it. At that time, it's just looking at the PCC, posterior cingulate, and its relation to basic things about attention modulation and what's included or excluded from experience. So part of the default mode network. But then that led to later adventures with Harvard, with Dr. Matthew Sackett and his team doing fMRI and EEG and a whole bunch of studies there where you really can see that at least something interesting and reproducibly happening with this stuff, which is very cool. And then right before that, my friend, Dr. Julieta Galante, who's an MD, PhD with a public health degree, who is a senior postdoc in the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge, said, hey, why don't you come help me start a project where we'll help the clinical mainstream better understand the highs, lows, and weirds and, plateaus of the path. And I said, okay, cool. And I was retired by that point, so I didn't have to worry about my career. And that meant I could just do whatever I did. Now, it wasn't like my book hadn't been online since the 90s, since before I went to medical school, but somehow nobody ever found it. Like nobody ever seemed to bother to Google me or look around at the curious stuff I was posting about or any of that. And so, yeah, these just for decades, these things didn't really interact until now we're in a period where through neuroscience and the zeitgeist and people coming together, we're much more able to have these sorts of conversations. And it really seems like a time now where we can talk about more esoteric things in serious contexts and actually do real science on them, which is a lot of fun. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. What a cool kind of emergence almost of having these two areas of life compartmentalized, but then being able to coalesce once the technology stack was there to be able to quantify it and make it measurable, manageable.
Yep.
And yeah, and so I'm also curious too, like for different attainment states, when working with these with individuals in labs, who would measure these brain waves, like what are some findings you gathered from quantifying different states of attainment, like different jhanic states or other systems that measure certain states of awareness?
Well, we've got a bunch of papers. If you look at the Meditation Research Center output with Matthew Saquette, you'll find a bunch there. And to summarize that could be a whole lot of work. Him and Avi and Chris Timmerman and other people on the team have done a lot of great work there. So these are somewhat complicated papers and somewhat complicated findings, but just a kind of a fun one, a little bit of data that hasn't come out, I don't think yet, is if you look at my brain scans on jhanas or stages of insight, and then you look at brain scans of people on various substances, my brain meditating, in short summary, kind of looks like the antithesis of modafinil or Provigil and looks much more like LSD or psilocybin or propofol. So when I practice, that's kind of what the brain patterns look like, which is interesting. And we actually are planning some studies that are going to actually compare deep fire Kasina stuff to DMT and then shut down fire Kasina with ketanserin and scan people on that. So we're dreaming up that study with my friend Chris Timmerman at University College London now.
Wow,
It's not like stuff. And if anybody knows where another $100,000 comes from, I found the first 100K. We need 100 more. So if anybody knows where the money for that comes from, it's not for me. It's for these good researchers so they can do stuff. So let me know. Help science.
Yeah, for science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there do you have a funder or something for that, like that people could go to, or we're just kind of more shooting you an email?
You could go to Emergence Benefactors or ebenefactors.org is the charity organization that you could give earmarked funds for that. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks. I'll put a link in the description for that.
Thanks. Shameless plug for our
very worthy cause. Very worthy. Yeah. On the offhand, have you also done this for like measured brain scans for anything that were more Western esoteric practices, or?
I have not yet. Although when you say Western esoteric practices, fire Kasina really does end up being a crossover thing. So this notion of looking at an element, tuning into an element, fire elemental meditation is very Western, right? So you can even find things like that in Donald Michael Craig's Modern Magic, for example, looking at a candle and candle gazing. And actually, I first got into this when Honey Bunny mentioned moving a candle with his mind. And he's like, oh yeah, you can learn to move a candle with your mind. And so I was actually on an insight meditation retreat at Bhavana Society. This would have been 2001, I guess, and started just playing around with a candle and seeing what I could do. And that led me into fire Kasina. And then I noticed that these ancient practices of Buddhist practices looked, in a whole lot of ways like the visualization, like the stuff you saw with Western elemental practices. And they all kind of start looking the same to me. And basically, the idea is you get your concentration strong enough and just the world of magic opens. So that's a strange thing to say. The vast majority of people, I think, who can't see the pentagrams they're drawing in the air or can't really see the deities they're visualizing in their tantric practice or whatever it is, go on a fire Kasina retreat. Not that this is necessarily a safe or sane thing to do. It isn't. We have tons of warnings on the website. So be careful. That's not an idle warning. Oh, it's so unsafe. No, it really can be challenging. So just look at we've got a whole safety page to try to keep you from going too far off the rails. But these practices end up looking the same. And the thing is, once you get your concentration really strong, such as through this elemental practice, which again is total crossover because the elements cross across all this, all of a sudden, all this stuff becomes possible. You draw your finger into the air and you just feel the sort of syrupy flow of the light trace, kind of flowing off of it onto space. And you're like, wow, check that out. And so, in that same kind of way, this is a doorway to the Western stuff. And so that's what I've used it for. And I've had a number of other friends, such as friends from the IoT, or other orders who have gone on these retreats and really appreciated the depth of access that some of these techniques lent them. But we haven't done the neurophenomenology of that yet. So if people are interested in that, get in touch with me. Again, particularly if you have any idea where the money comes from, figuring out how to fund this stuff is always the trick. It's always the main limiting factor.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an incentive for you guys listening.
There is.
Yeah.
fMRI times, $600 to $1,000 an hour. And then it's many thousands per hour of fMRI time that you collect to analyze it.
Wow.
Adds up.
Yeah. That's the real deal. Yeah. So, what are some, I suppose, what's like an equivocal Kasina fire practice that folks can start doing at home, like safely, I suppose, or as safe as it could be? Because I understand there's, as you said, 1-page warning of this type of practice.
It's longer than, we have a whole, it goes on and on and on. So what can you do at home? I think the funny thing is, so Fire Kasina retreats are these retreats we do. You can go to firekasina.org. So Fire Kasina with a K. And Kasina is just an old Pali word that means using an external something as a support for concentration practice, basically. And then the thing is, there are these threshold effects. So most people in the first day or so, within 6, 8, 10 hours or whatever, will start getting some cool colors and some neat stuff and a red dot, a yellow dot, and a black dot, and maybe some flashing images and some other cool things. And it's kind of fun. And then most people will then get into what we call the murk. And the problem with the murk is it's dark nighty, it's confusing, it's disorienting, it's irritating, and it makes you feel like you're broken. It makes you feel like the stuff doesn't work. And you'll think, this is useless. Okay, I can't do this. It doesn't make any sense. And even on retreat, when you're doing this like 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day, it can be 30, 50, 70, 100 hours of just murky garbage, or static irritation, spacing out, dark feelings coming up. That's, getting people through that and to the other side of that is a real trick. The thing is, if you don't get your concentration strong enough, which for most of us, it takes at least like 6, 8 hours a day to do, then you're not going to get to what we call the other side. And the other side of the murk is where all of a sudden all this stuff opens up and you've got, you can do the stuff in the air and you've got the color control and image control, and you start getting into the hyperfractals and the entities and the other realms and the more powerful experiences and all that stuff. And so for some people, they can get there in like 7 or 8 days on intensive retreat, but other people, it might be 10 or 12, which is why we tend to do 3-week retreats, right? So we do like 17 days of practice because there's sort of an organic arc to this for most people that we go on retreat with. And so like 17 days of practice and then like 3 or 4 cool down days to just sort of reintegrate a little bit and get used to ordinary reality, because one can get very, very sensitive. One can get very, very weird if you're living in a very altered reality, and that doesn't always go so well with normal reality. And so then that's why we do those retreats in these doses. And we very much actually don't recommend that people do shorter ones. Like, don't do a 7 or 8 day Fire Kasina retreat, because the chances of you ending murky is quite high. And it turns out ending murky is not a good idea. So people who end murky, where they're still in the murk when they leave the retreat, they've reported all kinds of stuff like headaches and dizziness and irritation and relationship problems and finding reality harsh and jarring and irritating and stuff like that. So then there are people who say, well, on an hour of Fire Kasina a day, they do actually start getting into stuff. And I've had that happen to me too. But a lot of people will relatively rapidly hit the murk and then they give up, because they think, oh, this is broken. It doesn't work. This isn't any good. And they don't have the patience to get through it. And then the question is, in daily life, can you get to the threshold doses that are required to break through into the other side in daily life? certainly the old practice manuals, they're skeptical of most people being able to do that. They say it's very, very rare. And that's kind of been our experience as well. So the powersy stuff, like the reproducible control and access you get on the other side of the Merc on retreat, is almost nothing like the occasional hit or miss glimpse of a thing or flash onto something that you get in daily life, which is cool. Like, it's cool to know it's even there. And that can happen sometimes in daily life practice with this stuff, but it's also very unsatisfying in comparison to what retreats are like. So if you really want to give this a shot, 3 weeks, my recommendation, 17 days with a few cool down days and a pretty high dose. And if you want to do that, then you should read all warnings. Yeah, we've got about a 1 in 9 flip out rate, at least to some degree. And that's pretty high. And I don't mean that like lightly. I'm sort of laughing and haha, because that's my sense of humor and coping mechanism, but haha, not funny, really at all. Just another warning of the fact that esoteric practices can be dangerous. And this is a strong example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Life's not safe inherently, and neither are these practices.
Yeah. We think of this retreat as kind of like climbing climbing Mount Everest on acid, basically.
So that sounds kind of scary, like being sounds a little out of control, like Mount Everest
Yeah.
on acid.
Yeah.
But the Kasina fire meditation retreat sounds fantastic. Like that's something I'm thinking of, yeah, that sounds like an awesome retreat. I might want to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious too, like just from like a esoteric standpoint, like if you were to say what the murk is, like would you say it's like it's like this, like is it like an accumulated substance in people's astral, mental, like akashic field through each or any one of the sense gates, or like how deep is this murk going? How deeply are we clearing? How would we break that down?
Well, the first thing is every single time I do one of these retreats, I have to go through the Merc just like everybody else. So the notion of clearing or getting rid of it, I think, is not true. It seems to be like you've got normie reality perception, and then you've got other side of the Merc reality perception. And while you're rewiring this brain in a neuroplastic way to be this other thing, then there's this glitchy phase where like you're rewriting the code while the operating system is running, you're rewiring the car while it's going down the road. I don't know, like that tends to go strangely, and you're reconfiguring it to do this entirely different thing. And so in the same way that like a caterpillar sort of has to dissolve to become a butterfly, your perception of reality kind of has to dissolve and do this very glitchy thing to get to the other side where it's perceiving magical stuff. And then you can also kind of perceive this weird thing where on the come down as you're coming out, it could be a little glitchy too. So as you're going back to normie reality and all the, magical effects start to go away, it's not as bad as going there. Getting into it is harder than getting out of it. So what is happening on retreats? I tend to sort of tell funny stories about you're trying to get to the fairy city, but they don't want you to find it. So they throw all this stuff in your way, and they throw, swamps and miasmas and phantoms and demons and quicksand and gadflies or whatever. They send all these things to torment you, to distract you, to cause doubt and fear, and to keep you off the path so you don't discover their beautiful fairy city. But that's just a story like this. But magic is based on stories, and myths, and have a resonance. But I guess you could talk about it as clearing out something. Oh, the thing is, it doesn't stay cleared out, because every time you do this, there's still the same entrance price. I like to think of it more as just the entrance price to the other side, or the rewiring of the radio to be magical, or the brain to be magical and to perceive things in a magical way. And yeah, that's very different from how we ordinarily do things. And it's sort of like if you had a radio that was like built one way, like let's say you had an AM radio and you wanted to turn it into an FM radio, where you're going to have to take out the this and the that, and you're going to have to put in these components. And while you have the radio kind of disassembled, if you tried turning it on, it might just make staticky sounds or something. It's not going to do anything. But once you get it fully assembled, all of a sudden it's going to pick up this different signal. You might keep something like the same antenna, although you might have had to change it. The speaker would probably be the same. The power source might be the same. Some of the tuning mechanisms might be the same. But the fundamental way it relates to radio waves or reality is going to be pretty different. And so in that interim period, it really feels like the radio is taken apart and just doesn't work. And you're going to reconfigure it on the other side. Although it's hard to tell that reconfiguration is happening until it happens. It's funny, you're just like hours and hours and hours of gray garbage. And then all of a sudden, wow, oh, there we go. It can be quite sudden and dramatic. And there's no obvious way to tell when it's about to happen, where suddenly you get into the other side and you're like, okay, got it. Cool. And you break through. It's sort of like if people have taken DMT or 5-MeO or something like that, and like sometimes you break through and sometimes you don't, and it's kind of hard to tell why. Sometimes it's like that.
Totally. Yeah. So I've got two questions to pair with what you just shared. The first question is about um, like, so after you've broken through, what does maintenance look like? And then the follow-up question is, I appreciate you sharing that like the murky phase happens for everyone, even if you've had attainments and you've been doing this for decades. Because I think
I've got
sometimes
about 15 or
there's a perception of self-actualization where people have this perception that people, once they have like an attainments or enlightenment or what have you, that it's in maintenance forever, in permanent equilibrium. But that doesn't appear to be the case for anyone I've ever met. And that things need maintenance because, Newton's second law.
Yeah. So the first thing is I agree that is a shock to people. The next thing is that's what they say in the old text, though. They say one practicing the fire Kasina or one of these Kasinas while they are doing it will have the access and then they lose it. So that's considered normal. It's while you're powered up, as we call it, that you have the access and then it fades. And like what I can do off retreat, I'll get glimpses of stuff and sometimes I can see stuff and sometimes little things will happen, but it's not even a tenth of what I can do when I'm powered up. And then once I cut the power, once I stop practicing my full retreat hours, it'll usually fade within a day or two, sometimes even within hours. It'll just all of a sudden, it's just gone. The access is just gone. It's quite surprising. And then you're just like, nope, it's gone. Okay. And so maintaining that full level of power, I don't know anybody who can do that. If they exist, maybe they do. I don't know them. I think to even attempt to hold it, God, probably 3 or 4, 5, 6 hours a day. I don't know. Good luck. And then the thing is, you're going to be all retreaty. You're going to be weird. Like the retreat brain, the fire Kasina retreat brain of a full powered up thing is not the kind of brain that works in daily life that well. Like, is this the brain you want to be like driving in traffic and going to like, high intensity meetings with power players in your industry or whatever the heck it is, or dealing with customer service irritations or whatever it is you do? I don't know. Or like young children screaming at you. Do you want to be in that hypersensitive, very magical state of mind? I don't know, probably not. And so that's why we have these power down days to make sure we don't go crashing back into the airport or intensive travels or whatever high powered tech job these people have or whatever it is, because they're just not particularly compatible states of mind with ordinary life. I mean, if you were like in a forest, in a quiet cabin or on a beach somewhere, okay, I could see wanting to keep up the power. But for ordinary normal life, for most people, no. Like you'll see if you do this, it just doesn't sound appealing. And I don't know anybody who's found it so.
Yeah, that makes sense. That the brain, the neuroplasticity of the brain is wired for the retreat, and that's its own context. And then everyday life requires completely different demands and attention, task switching, and a different attunement to the space and environment, instead of being fully attuned to the development of one's sensory experiences.
Right. Because like, I'm sitting here talking to you and like, I'm one of these people who like space always has a little bit of kind of sparkly, staticky color to it. So I look kind of like a person who has HPPD, where you take a psychedelic and you still kind of stay psychedelic. Well, I've kind of actually been that way. I was sort of born that way. But as I've done more fire Kasina, like I'm a little bit more that way. But like I could either pay attention to like the stuff in between the monitor and you and start, seeing how that starts to form itself into something. But that'd be very distracting if I'm actually trying to have a podcast with you, right? So I kind of ignore the subtle colory stuff in between you and the monitor, and I just focus on you, because otherwise it'd just be like, like that doesn't go very well in society. Very quickly, it does not go well, right? So responding to internal stimuli is a quick way to end up in front of a mental health, practitioner.
Absolutely, understand. Cool. So what are some things that you feel people? What do you gather about folks doing like kind of more hardcore, like, you've covered the hardcore Buddhistic practices and mindfulness practices, retreats. What is hardcore evocation, practice look like? Or working with spirits, either through invocation, data yoga, evoking?
Wow. What does that look like? I mean, obviously that takes 1,000 different forms, right? So there's so many different ways to do this. What it looks like in most people, if they do a lot of it, is pretty darn weird, right? So I talk about this sort of tension between how your brain is built and how you're functioning in reality and how people around you are going to react to that. So I'm sure plenty of people in the audience, if you've gotten far enough into the realm of spirits and that sense that they are real, and that sense that you can interact with them, and the sense that they may have their own agendas, and all of the stuff that comes with that, because that's like usually with that is a package, right? And the package is not just an entity, but entities. And the package is not just entities, but also energies. And the packet is funny things about time and karma and like, what's behind a person's actions and possession and bargains and the sense of like what you're calling in or out, and then protection stuff. So very quickly, the practice of entity leads to this whole thing, right? And then obviously, as people, I assume you're magical practitioners in the audience, that could be a very rich world and a very re-enchanting world and a fascinating world. And it can also be a frightening world and a destabilizing world and a confusing world and a rapidly life-ruining world, particularly if you have the unfortunate thing to tell somebody about it who doesn't understand it. And then like biggest thing obviously then is, can you shut it off? So in the same way that I think on the car, the switch and the brake are more important than the gas pedal, and the steering wheel is certainly vastly more important than the gas pedal. Unfortunately, a lot of people, particularly when they first get into magic, if any of you are young practitioners, all they want to find is the gas pedal, right? The on switch and the gas pedal is what they're looking for because they want to go somewhere. But where you're going, and can you stop and slow down, and is there emergency brake, and like, can you stay on the road and not wreck your car or anybody else's car, are actually vastly more important than whether or not you can go fast or even go at all. So in the same kind of way, I mean, to keep being, all these warnings about magic, always talking about warnings of magic. If if people seriously get into this, you see what I'm talking about. And it can simultaneously be really fun and cool, but also disorienting and distracting and can make people very, very, very bizarre. And that doesn't always function well. So you've got to, there's a cool book I like called My Years of Magical Thinking by Lionel Snell, which is kind of fun for helping to keep some of these paradigms straight. For those who haven't found that book yet, not his real name, but
Yeah, because so there's a lot of paradigms and ways to kind of interface with reality, a lot of operating systems or programs to download, and then if we're running certain operating systems or programs, some of those are highly adapted to society and functioning and happiness, and others may be a bit more potentially imbalanced. And so that's a very tricky thing, and you need a real technician or someone who really understands the mind OS, the hardware, software, to understand that and see what's contextually appropriate for someone. So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, very nicely put.
Yeah.
Yeah, and drama. So the world of entities almost always involves some kind of drama, right? That's part of the fun and part of the problem, right? It's like everybody wants to live in the world of Harry Potter until you actually look at the movies and you're like, you sure? You sure you want to live in the wizard world? Really? Like, okay. And certainly, would you want to live there full time? Like, it's funny, you see like in the later Harry Potter movies, particularly Harry Potter 7 or some of these places where he's just like, at the beginning of one of the later Harry Potters, I can't remember if it's 6 or 7 or something, where he's just like in this coffee shop reading a newspaper, and there's the waitress, and he's like having normal interactions, and then Dumbledore like appears across the street at Subway, and he's like, oh God, I've got to go back to the wizard world. He's having this sort of nice break from it, and you can sort of feel he was sort of tired. If you do this long enough, you can sort of start to appreciate that feeling of, yeah, it's cool, but do you want to live there all the time? I don't know. Some do. Some don't have a choice, but for those who do,
Yeah, like, I appreciate just hanging out in a coffee shop and people watching, taking it slow, but like we can trip to Hogwarts is one thing, but I think being there full time as faculty, like, I don't know.
Right.
I like that analogy. That's really fun.
And then the other thing is, if you're doing this stuff, like, why are you doing it? So like really look at why you're doing it. Why do you want power? Why do you want adventure? Why do you want an enchanted reality? Not that those aren't interesting things, but potentially very valid things and potentially very revelatory things. And we can learn fascinating lessons and have amazing enhancing experiences and transformations of consciousness and all of that cool stuff and healings. But if you look honestly at why you're doing this, like I can't tell you the number of magical practitioners that I've talked to that are doing all this stuff, and you just keep asking why they're doing it and why they want that and why they want that. And then you get down to, oh, I just really wish my girlfriend was like nicer to me. And like, that's like maybe the root reason or something that they're doing incredibly esoteric stuff that they had never maybe even admitted to themselves, and how in the world their esoteric practice relates to their girlfriend being nicer to them or something. Like, who knows, but usually feels very indirect. And so not that, waking up and things like that are incredibly valid goals in pretty much any life context. I think they are. But a lot of the powersy stuff, usually there's something pretty interesting behind it. So tracking back the root of where the interest comes from, tracking back the root of where the juice is, I think is really vital, because if you don't do that, whatever that source is, that wellspring of interest, its subconscious or unconscious aspects will bleed into your practice and will come out and will show you something, will beg to be understood, but sometimes in a magical or archetypal or sometimes very confusing or scary or dramatic way. And so just recognizing that doing some of the very ordinary work of just sitting honestly with our motivations and our personality styles and our attachment styles, and doing some parts work and basic stuff like that, I think is really critical for having a wise and balanced relationship to our magical practices.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you contextualize it with the incentives. That's the baseline thing. Like, why do this to, try to get your girlfriend's attention when you can exercise or work out or develop yourself in the functional world over that. One of my understandings, culturally, anthropologically, sociologically, is that a good quantity of people who got into the meditative arts, or and then later on more magical things, is that it came out of a cultivation of having had mastery over aspects of their physical life, mental, emotional, spiritual life, and then as an extension or a way to amplify those things that are already working for them, and to do that. Whereas I've seen as a culturally, I've seen like a good portion of people who are only drawn to esoterics without having other parts of their life sorted out, whether that be physically with their health, wealth, mental health, relationships, that it only kind of almost amplifies their pre-existing issues, and then the practices they do try to act as mirrors for those very things that they are needing to heal in their life, but then they're often looked over because they're not looking for it. They're not looking for healing. They're looking for something. And considering how culturally, say in the United States, for example, things are highly atomized, there's a lot of, in some areas, there's a lot of cultural disintegration and fragmentation due to financial, socioeconomic incentives, globalization, and other things, which have tons of pros, but also some very clear cons, that there isn't a cultural integration or framework through which to have more explorative experiences in a spiritual context yet. But people also don't know that because we tend to look at the past anachronistically through the lens of our present moment. So yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, as someone who's well read in history and on these types of movements.
Well, first, yeah, what you said about people getting into esoterica without more foundational practices, without a more ethical frame, without basic training in psychology, without good hygiene habits of sleep, of exercise, of diet, of lifestyle, of service, of good socialization, or just like they have, unfortunately, one of the personality disorders or cluster B traits in particular. Yeah, it can be an absolute mess, as we've all seen and known. Anybody who's been part of a magical order or temple or whatever it is, you get to see that usually very quickly. So, Yeah, so I don't think it needs a lot of elaboration. And your point about the fact that without a historical grounding or a cultural grounding, or like wiser elders and more mature people who aren't in those roles for power or domination or whatever it is, without that, without like a grandmother or something that also came up in this who can give you good advice as she makes you cookies or something, that lack of cultural and historical depth does lend a real ungroundedness and unrealisticness and sometimes a lot of tragedy. So that's true. On the other hand, I totally get that in the face of what can sometimes seem a very materialistic culture, certainly at least in aspects of the West, depending on how you grew up. I mean, like if you grew up, you know, conservative Christian, that's a magical culture from a certain point of view, right? It's healings and blessings and miracles and all that stuff. Okay, but if you grow up in more of a secular culture, or even you grow up in a tradition that has its mystical elements, but you weren't exposed to them, like a lot of Catholics grow up, and the Catholicism they grew up in is not very mystical, right? It's more guilt and ritual and some nice services and sermons, but maybe not much deep end stuff. And so growing up without that, I agree, can be very, very limiting. And then obviously the thing then is to see if you can find good community. And again, the problem is the magical communities tend to be some of the worst in terms of attracting people with more narcissism or psychopathy and some of the other cluster B traits. Not quite sure why. That'd be a fascinating thing to look at, but it's true. And so figuring out how to have wise community to provide a more ethical, cultural foundation for good practice is often a trick. That's for certain.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because my understanding from reading a bit about the history of quote unquote magical societies, Freemasons, I forgot the other ones, that to have these types of teachings or to have them presented available to you in the West, Eastern cultures, ethics, moral upstanding, being deeply functional in reality and in the society and culture you're a part of is always a prerequisite.
And certainly
Even
in Buddhism, they wouldn't teach you this stuff like until you have a lot, formal training and, often at least a novice or a monastic. And then you've got a whole lot of rules of conduct, and you're doing this in the context of a sangha, and you're first learning ethical behavior. And then you might learn some concentration stuff to give you a grounding and ability to regulate your mind and your nervous system in the face of things. And you would also be coming up in a cultural context that already included spirits and powers and realms and all of those karma and all of those kinds of concepts, since, you grew up in it since you were born, certainly in the traditional context. And all of that would have provided a much better foundation for these interesting sorts of experiences than Instagram-based exaggerated corporate fascism or whatever.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well said. Well said.
Or oligarchy. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
same kind of these days.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to add or share about, if someone's dysregulated right now, they're watching this, they got like video games and another tab, mine's in a lot of places. They're like in a fight or flight state. They don't even know it. Maybe the breathing's incorrect. Their posture slouched. So they have all these things going against them. Like, what's like one step they can take towards coming back to a regulated state? Either their nervous system, their mind, all the above. What would that look like for someone to take one step in that direction and the next step?
Well, the tricky thing there is that, like, if I say, okay, tune into your breath in your abdomen, but your abdomen is like where you store some trauma, that might be dysregulating for some people. So actually, it's hard to figure out what's the like one quick trick, because everybody's a little different. Their bodies are different. What's happened to their bodies are different. Where they store like various triggers might be different. So there's a really cool book I'm going to recommend by David Treleaven and with Willoughby Britton called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. I think it gives a really interesting introduction to things about dissociation, things about trauma, things about the body keeping the score in meditative contexts, which certainly apply to magical and esoteric contexts equally. I think that's a really interesting place to sort of begin and think about how to recognize subtle things like dissociation or some of these habitual behaviors of distraction that may be, something related to how we're coping. Not that distraction and dissociation can't be very useful coping skills in certain contexts. They can be, and that's why we do them. It's the body's natural defense. But figuring out how to bring a little meta awareness to those sorts of things can be very, very helpful. So I would recommend those kinds of resources. And you were mentioning just sort of ethics and magic. There's a fun book I like. I think it's called Spellcaster: 7 Ways to Effective Magic. It's like one of these simple early, like, tells you a bunch of different techniques. But one of the things it does a really nice job is its ethics. So something of the ethical vibe of that, I think, is really good. So for beginning witches and wizards out there, fun stuff. And then if you're like more of a meditative practitioner, I think For a Future to Be Possible by Thich Nhat Hanh is a really nice book. Talks about ethics. It's good.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. I wanted to ask if there was something that in your experience could help people pull themselves into a more grounded state if they're in a fight or flight state.
Again, here's the trick. So, like, there are a bunch of different techniques to ground yourself, but they might vary by the person. So, usually, I want to have a conversation with people uh, because, again, as I mentioned, there are plenty of ways that people's bodies may be stores of complicated things. Like if I say, oh, ground your attention down on your feet, but you're like an older person with diabetic nephropathy, maybe that's not the best place to put your attention. Or if I say, pull your attention down to your lower pelvis, but something unfortunate happened related to that, maybe that's not your best thing. So, or even take a deep breath and maybe you've got COPD, or maybe you have like, you get into panic attacks when you start paying attention to your breath for whatever reason. Like, so the problem is a lot of this advice really needs to be given to a person in context. And you're sort of assuming a young, healthy audience that may not have any trauma or may not have any body issues or may not have any whatever. But the thing is that, like, I don't know what the audience is and I don't know what you have. And so there's a thing where, like, if you've talked to enough people, you find an exception to every rule. And then it gets harder to give general advice that you can really feel comfortable putting out to a general audience. That also can be limiting, but just recognizing that people do have to find things that work for them. Obviously, for a lot of people, just a few calming breaths is going to be really good. But for some people, that's just trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate the granularity and the intellectual and earnest transparency in that, because like the Buddha said, it's either for 80,000 people, 80,000 different medicines, or 10,000 people. It's been paraphrased a few ways. And yeah, it's like every single person has great granularity in their beingness. And that's where there's value in having community of people who can help one establish and discover their own granularity. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So was there any last pieces of advice you'd like to give folks on the show who may be curious about Buddhism, who have maybe more secular understanding of Buddhism, but may want to undergo a practice of refinement of their brain, concentration, awareness, and to develop their neuroplasticity, so that they can be a lifelong learner on the path to self-actualization?
Well, I think just recognizing the tremendous potential of these techniques to go vastly farther than most people coming into this stuff have any idea about, and read broadly. Obviously, I like my book because it talks a lot about these things, but it's certainly not for everybody. It's long, it's complicated, it's kind of technical, it's sort of controversial, sometimes very controversial. But just, I think most people who are coming in from secular contexts really have no idea how powerful these practices can be, or where they can take a person, or that this person could actually go there in relatively reasonable amounts of time with relatively reasonable opportunity costs, or that these things could also go horribly sideways. So, like chapter 30 of MCTB, if you're having strange things happening or you want to know what can go wrong, maybe check that out. Yeah. Or if you're more like psychedelically inclined, as a lot of people in the magical communities are now, then you might check out the work of Jules Evans in the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, that we've been doing a lot of research on how to give people high quality information on what happens when psychedelics don't land right. So, because that can also happen. So those are just some bits of advice that might be helpful. And check out the work of Willoughby Britton and the VCE lab out of Brown. Good stuff.
Yeah, that's really great. And I also wanted to know a bit about insofar as we talked a bit about psychology, then there's pop psychology, there's Buddhist psychology, if I'm paraphrasing that correctly. What are some different ways for people who really want to begin serious introspection, contemplation of themselves, ego defenses, and figuring out how to let go of or be able to do practices towards self-actualization in spite of ego constructs or other things that may be inhibiting them in the way? What are some steps that they can do to get real contemplation and transformation?
Well, actually, some of the first things I would recommend, weirdly enough, is doing some of the basic things like parts work, which IFS or one of its variants, or there's a range of techniques that can do something like that. I think is really interesting and just keeps showing up as something that people have found very, very valuable. Understanding your attachment style will save you a staggering amount of pain and confusion on the path, and how you relate to traditions, to gurus, to communities, to yourself, silence, and solo retreats or group retreats and silence. Learn about the mature and immature coping mechanisms. So learn about projection and denial and minimizing or catastrophizing, or like you know uh, repression, just basic Psych 101, and then learn about the cluster B personality disorders and the personality disorders in general. But if you have some basic understanding of those, it will also save you a lot of trouble. So just that kind of really basic work, which is going to sound really boring to people, and he didn't say something wild or flashy, but if more people did that, I think vastly more people would get vastly farther with vastly fewer problems with communities, with themselves, with their internal experience on the path. So that's my heartfelt advice.
100%, 100%. And I've learned a lot of these things too, like with IFS or parts work, learning about the projection, mature coping mechanisms like sublimation, versus more immature ones like projections or lashing out, and like it's extremely helpful. And these things are the furthest thing from boring. Like they help you recontextualize your entire life's history, relationships, you patterning your family intergenerationally, your friendships, people you meet, and it opens up so much more freedom. So like going back to the basics is so valuable, and I hope people. I also strongly recommend those things. I'm with you 100%.
Yeah. So it just sounds boring, but man, so many people could save themselves so much heartache.
Absolutely.
There isn't those around them.
Absolutely. Sweet. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I really enjoy your work. Your websites are great. Like you've got several websites, and I'll link all of them below. Your book, yeah, the book's fantastic too, and has really, really good book recommendations as well.
Thanks.
That are mind expansive and opening. I really like one book recommendation I particularly liked of yours was like one on like sex and Buddhism and how it evolved over hundreds or thousands of years between the different sects. And that was very mind expansive.
Yeah, John Stevens does good work. Yeah, so many people doing great things in the space. So very grateful for all of the people who write in this space and are working to contribute to it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And do you have any upcoming treats or seminars or appearances you're also going to be doing?
That's a good question. I just did a meditative thing at Harvard, I think yesterday, but I don't know if I have much that's scheduled upcoming. And the retreats I do are all private. So I have only done one retreat that was really open to the public, and that was in 2018. And I co-chi Stronghold when I got invited to teach down there before John and I realized we didn't like each other that much. Yeah, Chuladasa and the TMI guy. Anyway, long story, but that was the last. After a month of that, I was like, yeah, I'm not doing this for the public anymore. It's just, I'm not built for it. So all the retreats I do are private. But if you're interested in organizing your own retreat, I like putting out a lot of materials so people can hopefully figure out how to get a good group together and do something ethical together and safe. And there are also people around in these communities who sometimes like to help spot people or provide some guidance if people get into trouble. So reach out, build community, and yeah, figure out how to do good practices yourself. My best advice.
That was great. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really fun.